Let's kick off then. So, good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining today's webinar on building a better and faster and more smarter Azure. So we'll be covering Azure Landing Zones today. So how these relate to building secure cloud environments that grow with your organizational requirements as you scale out your cloud footprint. In terms of quick housekeeping, so just a reminder that today's session will be recorded and the slide deck will be made available to participants after today's call. If you have any questions, please take advantage of the Q&A feature in the chat, and we'll be answering as many questions as we can at the end of this session. So today, in today's agenda, we'll cover some of the common mistakes that we see a lot with Azure environments and the short and long-term impacts these bring. We'll then focus on how Azure Landing Zones are designed to prevent these mistakes, what they bring, and how they help build security and governance controls into your cloud operations and operational management. We'll discuss a real-world example of how an organization has undergone an overhaul of their existing Azure environment with a before and after of their operating model and delivery mechanism. And as I said, we'll finish up with a Q&A session and leave you with some key takeaway thoughts about your own Azure environment and how to address them. So just quickly introduce myself, Peter Thomas. I'm the Associate Director of Cloud and Security Architecture here in Ekco. Over 2 decades of experience covering multiple industries and verticals, and probably around 10 years in the Azure environment. Ian, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yep. Hello, good morning, everyone. My name's Ian Turpin. So I'm currently working as a cloud security architect for Ekco, but I've also had, a good number of years in working in IT, so 25 years plus, kind of, sysadmin type roles, but also architecture roles. I was working quite a lot in Asia for financial services within the Azure environment. So that was initially architecture, moved into a kind of a CCOE, so principally operations, and then moved into automation. Now back in the UK doing cloud and security.
Thank you, Ian. Okay, we're just going to have a quick poll here. So hopefully my colleague Kirsten will be opening this poll up. So quick question. So how big or complex is your current Azure environment? So A, you don't have any Azure in place, or it's a single pilot subscription with no workloads. B, 1 to 3 subscriptions with a few workloads deployed and 1 main team supporting. C, several subscriptions with multiple teams or third parties and varying standards. Or D, multiple subscriptions or regions delivering critical workloads with significant governance overhead. So we'll give it a few moments for the poll results to come in. I can see quite a few people coming through there. So yeah, looking good. Already around 45% growing and mixed. So option C seems to be the most popular one now. So fantastic, thank you. Okay, we'll move on now. So what we'll do now is we'll talk about some of the common mistakes that most organizations face and the impact they have with cloud adoption. We'll talk about recognizing these common mistakes and how you can help avoid them or correct your course quickly. So many organizations stumble into similar pitfalls when first adopting Azure without proper planning. Skipping Azure policy and governance early means that teams deploy non-compliant resources unchecked, for example, open ports or untagged spend. Organizations put everything into one subscription. It complicates management and silos everything, making it almost impossible to apply different policies or track costs. Not designing a cohesive network from the start results in ad hoc connections, overlapping IP addresses, and security gaps. using 1 or 2 admin accounts for all tasks with overprivileged permissions. This is one of the biggest security risks we see here at Ekco. If those credentials are breached, attackers have access to everything in your cloud environment. Environments without central logs or alerts means that issues and costs can sometimes go unnoticed until it's a big problem. Errors or breaches might go undetected, and it's challenging to troubleshoot since issues and logs aren't in place from the start. Manual deployments take significantly more time and effort and are not sustainable in incident response or recovery operations. Teams struggle to reproduce builds, audit changes, or scale reliably across subscriptions and environments. Now, these mistakes are common because Azure makes it very easy to start deploying without much overhead. The portal encourages very quick resource creation, which is great until you realize you've inadvertently created a Wild West cloud. By being aware of these pitfalls, teams can leverage landing zone principles as a safety net to catch issues before they happen. Ian's going to now walk you through what a typical cloud journey will look like.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. Yeah, so really, this slide kind of works on the previous slide. So a very common pattern we see with ad hoc cloud adoption. So it usually starts quite well. As Peter said, it's very low barrier to entry. You get your subscription, very easy to pay. There's no contract you need to put in place with Microsoft. And then you have a dedicated team who's looking to deploy a business service into Azure, maybe as a proof of concept. And before long, you know that team has then deployed something which then moves into a production environment, which is fine, nice and quick. You're up and running, your time to market is very short. And at the same time, other business areas in your organization, they get wind of an Azure environment. They start spinning up their own subscriptions. They tend to have nuances in terms of networking standards. They might have different naming conventions, different tagging, if they use tagging at all. And individually, these decisions make sense, but collectively they create a complex environment. So as the environment grows, governance starts to drift. Right? So tagging standards, security controls, they're not applied consistently. And what worked well for a very small environment with a dedicated team becomes very difficult to manage across multiple subscriptions, multiple applications, multiple workloads. So some of those technical decisions can become constraints. So unless you spend the time going through networking, identity, access choices, how you're going to do authentication, how you're going to do privileged account management in that environment, you can find that cost, operational visibility become challenges, and you don't have consistent ownership. So it's difficult from a change management and incident management perspective to work out who owns what, who's going to do what, who's going to remediate the issues which arise. So effectively, the end result is you have an Azure environment which works, but you have teams that are spending a lot of time troubleshooting. Right? They're managing exceptions rather than going through a standard boilerplate of deployment, and ultimately you get technical debt. So as your environment grows, that technical debt builds, and ultimately organizations then have to kind of retrofit best practices onto that environment, which then costs time, costs money. So ultimately, if it gets truly messy, very chaotic, you start having things like outages. So unplanned downtime when changes aren't go through the proper governance, or changes have unintended consequences. So so all in all, it builds not a good story to tell back to the business.
Yeah, good points, Ian. Thank you. So how do we fix this? So landing zones tackle this by starting with an organized plan. So before we explain the solution, let's review some of the main objectives of a landing zone and what it should include. So at a high level, the goal is to create a strong foundation before your teams migrate or scale their cloud workloads. The principal drivers of a well-designed cloud architecture should include setting clear guardrails up front, so policies, standards, and controls stay consistent across cloud environments. Security should be built in from the start with shared protection, threat detection, and aligned controls for every workload. Simpler day-to-day operations leveraging automation, central monitoring, login, and incident response in one place. Less duplication and better cost control, because shared platform services replace the need to rebuild the same capabilities for each workload. So the ultimate argument for Azure Landing Zones is cost avoidance in terms of both time and money. So, Ian, what's the cost of not having a good foundation, and what does Ekco recommend?
Yep. So yeah, very good question. So I mean, ultimately, when you're looking at the cost implications of that I guess poorly managed environment, so sometimes those costs don't appear immediately. Obviously, from an Azure perspective, you get a bill at the end of the month. But if you don't have standards in place, sometimes you get deployments which don't conform to your t-shirt size of virtual machine, for example. So what you have is an unexpected cost at the end of it. And also from an operational perspective, obviously you've got teams spending more time troubleshooting, more time unpicking those those architectural inconsistencies. So in terms of what we recommend, so don't be afraid to spend some time up front. A few weeks of planning initially is significantly cheaper than spending months or potentially years of remediation time. So you need to spend time, as Peter said, on those architectural patterns. You need to look at your operating model, try and define a good RBAC, potentially even drill down to a RACI and a very clear operating model. So secondly, all of this stuff doesn't have to be done from the ground up. Microsoft give you a whole load of collateral, which is very useful in bringing you up to speed, getting those standards in place. So the well-architected framework, there's a cloud adoption framework, there's a whole ream of Microsoft best practice, which you don't necessarily have to adopt verbatim, but you can modify it depending on your organization size, your level of skill, and your level of maturity and appetite for cloud adoption. So the third thing is it's not fire and forget. Obviously, it's going to be a continuously changing environment. So you need to have a continuous improvement mindset, both in terms of what the business require and in terms of services that Azure bring to the market. So those services might be very key to your business. You might want to adopt them, but you need to have governance to make sure you can deploy them effectively, you can monitor them effectively, you can scale them effectively, and that they're managed and protected in accordance with your policy. So, and lastly, and probably maybe the most importantly, what you want to do is underpin all of that via automation, if you can. So use infrastructure as code. It's going to save you a whole load of time. It'll obviously remove the manual effort. It will improve ultimately your security, and it also in terms of time to market. So you make your code change once, and that change can then be promoted through your environments to eventually reach production. So, I mean, together these principles help organizations. They avoid that costly rework, and they focus on delivering business value rather than fixing preventable problems. So the next question really is, what does that foundation look like in practice? So if you can move to the next slide, Peter, and then you'll probably want to talk a little bit about the organizational structure in the first couple.
Yeah, so in practice, every Azure environment should consider these foundations or building blocks from the very beginning if you can. So plan your organization's subscriptions around and group them hierarchically. So instead of a flat sprawl, use management groups. So think of these like folders for subscriptions. This creates a clean management structure. So you have separate groups for production and non-production, or internal versus external workloads. For a small or a mid-sized company, it doesn't have to be complex. You can start with a small platform landing zone for shared services. That's your network, identity, connectivity, security, and then a single application load for your business workload. This hierarchy is vital though. It's how you will apply consistent policies, security, access controls, tagging, billing rules across all of your subscriptions without having to repeat yourself manually. Implement those governance guardrails early on. This typically means using Azure policy to enforce audit rules across the environment. Governance policies can also cover things like requiring encryption at rest or disallowing unapproved regions or VMs, enforcing cost tags for cost tagging, or forcing diagnostics on logs on resources. So these policies, when applied at the high scope, at the management group level, ensure all new resources automatically comply with your standards. So that good governance up front ensures you prevent security misconfigurations, like exposing a storage account or a VM RDP port to the internet, rather than having to go back and retrofit them later on. Ian, do you want to talk about security and a few other points here?
Yep. So security, obviously, security is central because it's placed in the middle of the slide, but ultimately security and monitoring should be established as shared platform capabilities from day one. So what we do see is security, not necessarily an afterthought, but it tends to be implemented at the end of the development lifecycle, right? So the kind of shift left mentality is you bake that security controls, the monitoring and logging, threat detection, they're built into the foundation, right? So it ensures that every workload benefits from the same baseline protections. So Microsoft offer a whole raft of services, so Defender for Cloud, Azure Monitor, Log Analytics, Azure Key Vault to maintain secret certificates and keys, and they are deployed as shared platform capabilities. So this improves operational visibility, simplifies management, and closes the security gaps which inevitably emerge as your business grows. So identity and access management, you need to think about how you're going to control that identity, how you're going to authenticate, authorize, and ultimately audit that access within the environment. There's plenty of cases where we've seen a few shared generic administrator type accounts or root accounts, which a lot of people are aware of. So you want to try and move away from that generic access, make sure that the identity and access is very controlled. Once again, Azure offer a raft of services around role-based access control, conditional access, which you might already have in your organization, multi-factor authentication, and privileged identity management. So that ensures that you only get access when you need it, and that access can be subject to approval workflows. So, and finally, network design, right? So this kind of underpins, it's a foundational service, underpins everything else. Difficult to change once you've got it in place, because we're talking about hybrid connectivity. So how your on-premise environment is going to connect into the cloud, if that's ExpressRoute or VPN or virtual WAN. And this typically includes a hub and spoke design. So the Azure Landing Zone pattern is we have a central network and then you have spokes hanging off that network. So those are the core foundations, and they work once you establish them early. Then you can grow with confidence instead of continually revisiting those earlier design decisions.
Thank you. No, very good points in there. So each of these foundations, they reinforce each other. So for example, a well-defined identity roles combined with proper subscription management means you can safely delegate control to your teams or to your third parties without giving away the keys to the kingdom. Network topology and aligned with governance policies ensures security and compliance are enforced by design. In combination, they prepare your Azure environment to scale smoothly while staying compliant. So by focusing on these building blocks holistically, organizations of any size can ensure their Azure environment can stay manageable and safe, even as it scales. Each of those considerations has got practical incremental steps that can be taken early, avoiding much costlier fixes down the road. So now we'll just talk about some of the high-level decision points that will help your organization adopt good practices within Azure. Ian.
Yes. Okay. So like the key takeaways, right? So, that upfront time, don't be afraid to think about architecture patterns. Get that bedded in, get it documented, even if it's diagrams and those architecture patterns. So it's very clear, it's unambiguous for the organization that when you deploy something into Azure, this is how it should be deployed, right? And that works in concert with an operating model. So who owns what, who is going to do what? Once again, it avoids ambiguity between different teams, and understanding where is Microsoft's responsibility. If you are an outsourcing organization, where is that application vendor or potentially operational support vendor, where do they sit? So the first bit, policy-driven governance. So Azure has Azure policy, which allows you to configure what you can and can't do within the cloud. So it's a set of guardrails that you can build in to ensure that the organization's governance and security requirements are met. So the next one is subscription democratization, right? Which is a bit of a mouthful, but ultimately what it looks like is, in terms of your operating model, how is that going to evolve over time? So most organizations, when they start out, they have a measure of governance. They try and centralize things, which is good from an operating model perspective, but ultimately that might not scale, right? So you need to think about where you want to evolve to. So what kind of measures are you going to give your third-party development vendors in terms of their application subscriptions and what they can do in there? And just make sure that they can deliver those business services, but within a set of agreed guardrails. So the next one is single control and management plane. So, what you want to do is try and simplify the environment. So don't have, a whole mix of different tooling. You can consider bringing your tooling from on-prem if it's fit for purpose. Ideally, it would be, cloud native type tooling. But ultimately, Azure offers, a single management plane, right? That's, the portal. It's going to be Azure CLI. It's going to be PowerShell. It's going to be Cloud Shell. So you want to try and focus in on making a relatively simplified architecture landscape from an operational perspective. The next one is application-centric service model. So I'm sure on-prem organizations, lots of virtual machines, lots of VMware, most things get deployed onto those VMs, right? In the cloud environment, you want to try and go for the cloud native solutions, try and abstract away from the operating system, not managing, dozens and dozens of virtual machines. You want to try and leverage application-centric services, so containers, those PaaS services, try and remove that overhead of patching, managing, backup, restore away from your organization, and then hand it over effectively to Microsoft to do some of that heavy lifting. And the last one, once again, try and simplify stuff from an architecture perspective. Don't have a big heterogeneous mix of tooling, and ideally, you could go for Azure Native. Obviously, Microsoft isn't the only player in the market, but we tend to find those Azure Native tools work very well together, right? So they support each other, they're better integrated, and they evolve alongside Microsoft's roadmap. So how does that look in reality? So what do you actually get out of the end of it? If you could go to the next slide, so I won't go through the slide, it's quite busy. What I want to try and express is, from a landing zone perspective, there are different types of landing zone, right? So, the first one is the platform landing zone, which is really your core foundation, right? So it's where you establish shared services such as identity, networking, security and governance, and monitoring and connectivity. So that's typically managed by a central team, either Cloud Center of Excellence or perhaps a platform management team. And then you have application landing zones. That's where your line of business services would sit. That's where your customer facing, your internet facing services would sit. And those can be federated in terms of that responsibility over to those teams within your business, or perhaps third parties in terms of being able to deploy those, once again, via infrastructure as code and deployment pipelines. And then what we do see is a take up of data and AI landing zones. So if you're a very data-driven organization, you might have copies of your production data, pseudo-anonymized or anonymized, and then some AI workloads looking at that and driving kind of data mining, business intelligence in terms of another landing zone offering. So the important thing to remember is these are not competing approaches. They're just effectively different types of landing zones, different security requirements, different operational requirements, and typically would have different teams responsible for the overall deployment, but not necessarily governance. Governance should be done centrally.
Thank you, Ian. Okay, so we'll have another quick poll here. Hopefully that will come through on the screen now. So for those audience who currently have an Azure environment, how do you currently build your Azure environment? Is it manually via ClickOps? Do you use infrastructure as code to automate? Or see you don't have an Azure environment? So put your answers in that poll. Pretty overwhelming so far that a lot of you are manually deploying. So probably 70+% are manually deploying there. Okay, so it's very interesting, considering that the earlier poll said, some of you have got a quite a growing Azure environment. So there's probably some benefits to what the infrastructure as code, the automation and the landing zones could bring to your organization. Okay, thank you for that. Now we'll move on to a case study. So this is where we'll talk about Ekco's approach and how we've helped one of our clients adopt these best practices. So for those who aren't aware, that between July and December of this year, Ireland will hold the presidency of the Council of the European Union for the 8th time. Now, it's a significant moment for the country. It places Ireland at the centre of the EU decision-making during a period of genuine geopolitical uncertainty. When a country holds that EU presidency, it becomes a more attractive target. Government systems, diplomatic communications, organisations connected to the EU operations carry greater intelligence value. The interest is not hypothetical. It's a pattern that has repeated itself across previous presidencies, as you can see from some of the previous countries here. So that visibility brings opportunity, but it also brings an elevated cybersecurity risk for all organisations. So in terms of what Ekco did here, and I'll stop sharing now for a moment. We'll just talk about the work that Ekco has done. Hopefully you can still see me now. Effectively, what Ekco did back in 2024 was conduct an Azure cloud adoption assessment for a client, for a large public sector organisation. Now, we won't name names, but that organisation then in 2025 had the same security risks present, and they were about to embark on a significant cloud deployment of new public-facing services. Now, as the organisation had grown organically over the years without a clear cloud model, their Azure environment had grown with the common mistakes that we talked about earlier, with the same kind of overhead and headaches. And in 2025, we identified 6 material risks across 26 of those subscriptions within that Azure environment. So that covered off things like public exposure of PaaS services. There was incomplete landings and guardrails and governance. They had privileged access for third-party software vendors with no clear RBAC model in place through and remote access. There was uneven observability and diagnostic settings across their security and posture management. The RTO and RPO, so their recovery ability and data residency, was not clearly evidenced. Finally, they were missing core central services that would have allowed these new applications to be deployed centrally. They faced having to redeploy the same Azure resources time and time again with increased costs. So that included things like web application firewalls or API management baselines. So what was clear from that assessment and the work that Ekco has done with that client was that if a single supply chain breach had happened through any one of the third-party vendors or software vendors, the organization had the potential to be completely exploited across its entire cloud footprint, not just within a single vendor, but across all of the cloud environment because of that those privileges being granted. Now, that had a significant impact on not only the organization, but also the Irish population who were consuming those services. So in terms of what Ekco did, Ian, do you want to just talk a bit about the work that we did then through 25 and this year?
Yep, absolutely. And it's an ongoing story, but from kind of late last year and through to up until this point. So what we did is we had a look at that existing environment. We decided quite quickly that it wasn't really fit for purpose, given those kind of 6 key highlights that Peter's gone through above. So we looked at obviously the Microsoft Cloud Adoption Framework. We deployed a new greenfield landing zone, so into the same tenant, but effectively went through the design steps in terms of that landing zone foundation with a clear management group structure, dedicated platform subscriptions, central policy guardrails and monitoring. And then from a ingress-egress perspective, we made sure that traffic was routing effectively north-south, so out to the internet, back to on-prem, and then east-west. So we had central policy controls, central network routing through Azure Firewall and Azure Front Door. And then we centralized API management. So needing to have a single platform where you can see all of the API configuration across the estate, and make sure that we reduce that the public exposure of services. So we deployed stuff using private endpoints, made sure that access was still permitted using a series of jump hosts. And then from an RBAC perspective, we made sure that the previous kind of mix of vendors who had owner, they had contributor type access, those permissions were removed. We made sure that we deployed all of the infrastructure using infrastructure as code. All of the application estate was deployed using code, and effectively any manual ClickOps was restricted, right, by policy. So we still had the ability to go into break glass, so kind of break fix for P1s, P2s, but ultimately everything was delivered via code, right? So the end result of that was you have a well-controlled environment. Ekco is acting as the technical security control for deployment. We had security scanning before anything got deployed, and we had approval loops for each of those deployment pipelines. So the final governance control was being assigned to the client. So if ultimately the client had, yes, no, does this go ahead in accordance with their change management procedure? So ultimately the result is we had centralized management of code under secure ISC delivery mechanisms via pipelines. We removed those elevated permissions across the vendor stack, and we increased that accountability. And once those privileged admin roles were removed and the new application deployment was secured using the pipelines and service principles, it allowed us and the vendor to focus on the business objectives and vendor management. So the software vendor was previously had a high level of access. They're now focused on their core competency, right, which is development, application build, and containerization. So, and Ekco, performs the security role within that. So the key takeaway is that the large organizations moved on from that kind of fragmented third-party lead delivery model to a secure by design, repeatable, compliant platform, right? The future application teams can build on, and they deploy public-facing services in safety. So Ekco is now replatforming the legacy Azure estate through the remainder of this year and then going into 2027. So in our final slide, we'll summarize the key areas for organizations to focus on and how you can avoid the mistakes that other orgs have made in the past. So back to you, Peter.
Brilliant. Thank you, Ian. Yes, very, very good example there of costly mistakes and how that organization is now remediating a lot of those earlier works. So final slide here now, and Just a couple of key takeaways here. So a well-crafted landing zone empowers growth instead of hindering it. By designing landing zones, you support new workloads and teams without sacrificing governance or performance. You don't have to build the perfect landing zone up front. You can begin with a minimum foundation, a platform subscription and a landing zone, and you can iterate as you learn and as you grow. Landing zones come with built-in security and resilient features. So network isolation to contain faults, security baselines, so standardized network security groups, firewalls and monitoring to catch issues, security vulnerabilities early. Logs are centralized, so if an incident happens, it's easier to troubleshoot and recover. Backup and recovery disaster plans, they're aligned to your business needs, not the other way around. Over time, as you grow and add more workloads, the consistent use of these measures reduces overall incidents, improves recovery. So if an issue does occur, you have a well-defined process to identify, to protect and respond. With a landing zone model, adding a new project or line of business or subscription doesn't mean reverting or reinventing your cloud setup. You can quickly, as Ian mentioned, you can quickly deploy a new subscription or landing zone from code. These come with preloaded network peering, policies, monitoring, and security. So that means you can quickly onboard new teams or applications, sometimes taking what normally would have been weeks of design and delivery into a matter of hours in certain cases. So as Ian mentioned, vendor teams, software teams, third parties who provide services to you, they can focus on deploying their applications, knowing that the environment that they're deploying into is secure. With everything structured, that cloud platform team means clear visibility across all of your resources. So from who owns what, how much is being spent through tags, management groups, budgets. So again, you can help visualize and report on what is being spent in Azure. Central monitoring dashboards, that gives you a single pane of glass for your health and performance metrics across your cloud estate. As a result, your organization can grow its cloud footprint without losing control. So the more it grows, the more important that initial structure becomes. In terms of organizations that have regulatory standards or internal policies that they need to adhere to, that landing zone approach streamlines compliance. Because controls like encryption, login, access policies are already in place, that can help you demonstrate to auditors that you have those controls and governance methods in place. So that can also bring a competitive advantage as well. So by demonstrating your compliance with a well-governed cloud environment, you can show that you've got a secure build, that your platforms are secure and scalable. And finally, remediation is costly. Now, again, as we talked about in that example, the companies that sometimes skip those basics end up spending a lot more, sometimes a year or more, to fix those core foundations, the identity, the networking, the governance, the design. If those had been planned earlier, a lot of that cost could be avoided. So to summarize, Azure Landing Zones help you build a better, smarter, faster, and most importantly, more secure Azure. So that's the end of the slide deck. And I think, Kirsten, we're going to have some questions now.
Yes, thank you both so much. I can call them out. A couple came in. Do you want me to read them or can you see them? Do you want me to call them out to you?
Yeah, if you could read out the first couple, please.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so the first one comes in. For a use case of an example of bad practice with Azure config, can you give an anonymous example of the implications and resolution impacts for an organization down the line?
Oh, yeah. Yes, again, this will be anonymized. So an organization contacted Ekco. Unfortunately, in one of the worst situations possible, they had suffered a cyber incident, and their e-commerce environment, their website, had been breached and hacked and effectively taken offline. So they couldn't take any new orders. They couldn't review any of their existing orders in flight. They had no visibility of their entire e-commerce platform. So Ekco was contacted to help to rebuild that environment. Now, unfortunately, the client at the time did not have their Azure environment built in code. It had all grown organically. There was no documentation per se. The environment had been built piecemeal over time with a third-party vendor. So over the course of a weekend, with some significant time invested by some of our colleagues, we quickly deployed a new platform landing zone, where the core central services, so the connectivity back to the on-premise environment, was stood up. We created the management structure. We started to create the application landing zone for the kind of e-commerce website. And that, again, with the third party, was kind of rebuilt from code within, over a matter of a weekend. Quite intense. It has demonstrated to the client that they had some significant gaps in their documentation. The third-party vendor had no controls over what was being deployed. So again, we went in and talked the vendor and the client through the best approach. They had that secure environment. The access permissions were removed. The public access of VMs and SQL databases were prevented and locked down. And we then helped to recover that client, as I said, in a matter of over a course of a weekend. Now, that's the worst case. Hopefully that never happens, because no one wants to have that phone call at 7 p.m. on a Friday night saying my entire e-commerce site has gone down. But no, very good question.
That sounds intense.
Mm.
Someone asked, are we going to get access to the webinar after? Absolutely. I'll send a follow-up mail. I'll try to get to it this afternoon. It'll contain the slide deck, a link to the recording on YouTube. And also, just to point out this, if you wanted to book an Azure assessment, I'm actually going to pop the link in the chat, because I know QR codes, security people, you're all very nervous of them. There's a link to a form. If you want to book an Azure assessment, just fill in your details in that form. It takes less than 30 seconds. One final question, and then I will let you go. What's the typical what's the typical time to stand up a new Azure landing zone? And is this easy to maintain once it's in place?
Good question. This all depends on, as we've talked about earlier, you can start small, or you can be as big and bold as you want. From a platform landing zone, again, these are the kind of the core components. It depends on your environment. So if you want to have connectivity back to on-premise, or you just want to have a completely island mode, it does depend. It does vary. But typically, we'd probably say from concept to deployment, probably a couple of days at most. Again, if it's very, very small, that time can be reduced even further to a matter of hours. Some of the biggest challenges, though, are, and some of the I guess, time-consuming parts are helping the client decide what's the kind of naming convention. How do you want the environment to be monitored? Do you have a team in place for consuming alerts and events? Do you have a SOC that can consume those security events and respond to them? So again, there's a couple of little components you all kind of plug in, but once you have those kind of decision points, we plug that into the code and push that out, and it can be deployed within a matter of hours. But no, great question.
Great. Okay. Well, I think that's it with the questions. Thank you. I'd like to really thank Peter and Ian for giving up your time. I know you guys, it's very hard to get your time, so I really do appreciate it. And of course, above all, thank you to everyone who stuck around to the end and gave your own time. Let's leave it there. Thank you both.
Thank you,
everyone. Have a great day. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye-bye.